So in this very last 10-minute talk, I would like to present you with two questions that hopefully are going to be fielded soon, and share in common the idea of using memory to improve the assessment of within variations in subjective well-being. So by within variations, I'm meaning I'm not going to talk about comparisons between people, but how to assess if a person is more or less satisfied over time. And a useful, very economist way maybe to think about this is to think it on a Cartesian axis, Cartesian plane, where on the x-axis you have different points in time, and on the y-axis you have some level of latent subjective well-being, which is increasing. And you can think at this latent construct, this mental state, as evolving over time and to be elicited at two different points in time, which are the moment of the survey, point t and t+1. Now, when we want to assess within variations, what we would like to find is what's the difference between these 2 points in subjective well-being. Now, there are 2 caveats. The first is that this curve is latent, so it's never observed. And the other is that these elicitations are never observed at the same time. So how can memory help? Before how can memory help? So the usual way to answer this question is to ask the respondent to map this latent satisfaction into a numerical scale. But a fascinating feature of the scale is that it could shift over time. A problematic feature is that any shift that we assess, it's impossible to distinguish if it's coming from a latent shift in satisfaction or a shift in the scale. Now, how can memory help? So I can see 2 ways. The first is to use recalled levels, ask people how satisfied they were on common scale some time ago. And another way is to ask recalled variation, so to ask people if they are more or less satisfied than a previous period. So here I'm displaying some existing studies that, all existing studies that I know that use this approach in some ways, and actually Mark Grisha worked on this topic, and these are the existing databases I'm aware of that they ask questions about recalled well-being, German, British, French, and South African database. Now, the recalled level goes this way. A person is asked to report past level of satisfaction. This past level is compared either with the present satisfaction, or 2 past levels are compared at the same time. And here there is an example of the question we would like to ask. Is the following: please consider the last 5 years. Taking all things together, how satisfied with your life were you in each of these years? Using a 1 to 7 or 0 to 10 scale. And what is interesting about this question is that it allows at the same time to have the reported, the elicited subjective well-being at the time of the survey, and the recalled subjective well-being. So if you think at memory as a line here, so differently, this dashed line can represent the recall process, which so maps back into time. Now, what are the problems with this approach? So the first is that memory can be imperfect. So the way I recall how satisfied I was some time ago could just do not correspond to my previous experience. But also I could just do not apply the same criteria to evaluate my current and past satisfaction. So that, for instance, this odd scale being that I'm a little bit less strict in the evaluation of my past subjective well-being than in the evaluation of my current well-being. There are also problems of dynamic inconsistency, in the sense that if a person had this level of satisfaction, whatever it means, at the period t-1, this person could recall it a bit differently the period after, but in another different way the period after again. And this problem of inconsistency applies also to scales where a person could have very good memory and consistent memory, but the scale is shifting. So after I presented all these problems, why would it be useful to ask the questions that I presented? So in my understanding, this question allows to jointly test the consistency of memory and the consistency of scales. So the extreme case you can think at is if a person is asked to rate the past levels of satisfaction, and this is consistent over time and with their past report, it's very likely that this person has both good memory and stable scales. And on top of that, anything we know about the recall function and anything we know about the scale shifting can help with each other, because any validated assumption on one hand help to understand where the variation is coming from the other hand. The second kind of question would be about recalled variation. The respondent is asked if to assess some variation with respect to a previous period, and typical question could be, overall, how dissatisfied or satisfied are you with respect to the last year? And then having a scale, which is here from -3 to +3, could be from -5 to +5 or something similar. And what is interesting with this approach is that instead of trying to compare two different latent points that cannot be observed at the same time, we would ask people to assess if basically they're feeling better. So instead of looking at asking, how are you feeling? And then how are you feeling again? We're just asking, do you feel better? And there is the caveat that this doesn't allow to infer the level, but it would be complementary to the subjective well-being level. You can think it as an economist metaphor, to have the level of GDP and the growth level as complementary measures. And I can see quite important advantages. So the first is that it fixes what the reference point. When you ask people about their life satisfaction, it's unclear if they are making interpersonal comparison. This makes it clear. You don't have ceiling effects in the sense that over time, people could report to continuously increasing their satisfaction or decreasing. And it would allow to obtain some granular information without having frequent questions. That is to say, I can ask you, how satisfied were you 1 year ago, 1 month ago, 1 week ago in the same survey? Now, the points I would like to have from you is, so the first is, this is quite a simple and naive approach. So it's, as it has already been mentioned, it's very common in the medical literature to have transition score, transition reports. But to the best of my knowledge, it's quite rare in subjective well-being research. And I would like to know if I'm missing something. Am I rediscovering the wheel, and it was abandoned for some reasons, or why don't we really ask this question? Positive. So another point is it actually a useful way of thinking at the problem, the fact of cross-validated assumption between memory and scale shifting? Do you find it actually constructive? And also a normative question. Do we want to measure if people are feeling good or if people are feeling better? These are pretty different things. And just to conclude, I would like to give you a positive note. We actually check the joint consistency of scale scale shifting and recall using the SWB data. So with Claude Senik, we looked at how people reconstructed their past well-being over the past 10 years and how they reported over the past 10 years their life satisfaction. And quite interestingly, the two figures are pretty consistent, which actually support the idea that to some extent, memory is not so bad and scale shifting is not so bad either. And with this, I would like to thank you and give credit to all the people who are actually trying with me to ask these questions. And I'm very happy to listen to your thoughts.